So last week I took a look at the local mode feature of Lucee CFML and I demonstrated the way in which it affects unscoped variable assignments. Now at the time I had only applied the local mode to a specific function, but you can also set application-wide default behaviors by setting this .local mode in the application CFC. And as JP pointed out to me after my previous post, doing so has caused some peculiar, unexpected variable assignments for him in his applications. And I wanted to dig a little deeper into that because it's an interesting use case and one that has a couple of little workarounds that I could find. So if we set the default behavior of the ColdFusion application here to be local mode modern, it means that any function that we have now will execute with that local mode of modern. And to test the way this behaves, the quirk that JP was running into, is I'm going to create a function here, and the function is going to assign a value to its local scope. It's then going to create a closure, which it's going to execute immediately as an iffy or immediately invoked function expression. This closure is going to attempt to change that variable contained within the local scope of the parent function, and then we're just going to return this and echo it out and see what happens. So the original value is what the parent function sets, and then the changed value is what the closure attempts to set. And if we jump over into the browser and we run this, we can see that we get the original value here, right? So what happened is this value equals changed because the application-wide default behavior is set to local mode modern. This unscoped variable assignment is actually being applied to the local scope of this closure, meaning that essentially it's creating another variable here as opposed to altering the original value, the original variable in the parent context. Now, I think this is working as expected, right? Because a closure is really just a function, sort of a specialized function. And because of that, it actually follows the same local mode settings that every other function, like this function declaration, is also following. So this unscoped variable assignment is essentially working according to spec. It just doesn't work the way that we might traditionally think it should work based on our historical usage of closures. Of course, local mode is not a historical feature, so we're trying to now merge our historical understanding of the way variables work with a rather new concept of this local mode affecting unscoped variable assignment. To get around this, we can do one of two things that I was able to figure out. The first is we can simply change the closure to not work in local mode modern. When we set this .local mode in our application.cfc, that's not a hard and fast rule. That's a default behavior, which means that we can override it at a lower level in our application. And in this case, what we're going to do is allow tests to run in local mode modern because that's the default, but we're going to tell our closure to explicitly run in local mode classic. And that's going to allow us to use this unscoped variable assignment and have it bubble up to the value that we are expecting. So if we jump over into the browser and we test this one, you can see that here we get b value changed. Right? So again, this changed is now propagating to the variable in the parent's local scope, and then that's getting returned and echoed out. So here we're getting the behavior that we would, let's say, quote unquote, expect, because this is the way we've used closures historically. So again, in this case, we're overriding the default behavior of local mode modern to become local mode classic just for the scope of this function execution, such that this unscoped variable assignment gets applied to the more natural variable that we would expect. So that's one way to work around this issue. The other way to work around this issue is to simply make this assignment not an unscoped assignment. Remember, the local mode only affects the way unscoped variable assignments work. So if we can find a way to put a scope in front of this value, then it becomes a scoped variable assignment and local mode no longer comes into play. So to do that, let's look at another example here. What I'm going to do is just create an alias to the local scope of the parent function. Here, I'm just pointing this variable context to local scope of test. And now, instead of using an unscoped variable assignment, I'm scoping that assignment to the alias here for the local mode of the parent function. Now, because this is a scoped variable assignment, local mode no longer comes into play, right? I'm no longer overriding that and making it classic. I'm simply providing a scope for the variable assignment, which now takes local mode out of play, giving us, again, that sort of historical behavior that we'd come to expect. And this time, if we jump over to that version and we run it, you can see, again, we get the changed value here. So that when we have this scoped variable assignment of changed, we're bypassing the local mode behavior and we're affecting the local variable within the parent context. Of course, this is kind of a pain. I would definitely prefer this version of overriding the local mode behavior itself at the local closure level. But more than anything, I probably just wouldn't set local mode at the application level. I would prefer to leave my ColdFusion applications running in local mode classic and then only define it at a specific function level where I think it's going to make sense. It doesn't dovetail enough with me. It doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't quite work the way I want variables to work historically. So it's just not a mode that I would opt into as a default. There are certainly use cases where I would opt into it because I think it will make certain things like dynamic rendering of CFML templates a lot safer, especially in a multi-threaded context like most ColdFusion applications are. But local mode of modern just wouldn't be my default choice. But to each their own, and hopefully this at least will show you some workarounds if you run into this issue where the unscoped variable assignment is not able to affect the local value that you thought it would.